last week, we saw this news. When I received the email, I simply could not believe that it happened. But we received this email that Professor Eshel Ben Yaakov passed away. His people did not were shocked as we. Tamar left us a message that she would like to say a few words, and we would like to respect him.
Okay, so I'm sorry for taking just 2 minutes of your time, but I'm going to take students here, and I would like to say a few words about Eshel. Okay.
If we just told him.
Already?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I'm Tamar, PhD student from the center, and I would like to say a few words about Eshel Ben Yaakov, or his full name, which was Eshel Rafael Breslav Ben Jacob, who passed away unexpectedly last Friday. And Eshel was a professor of physics at Tel Aviv University, who became very much interested in complex systems, and in particular biological systems such as bacteria and also the brain. And he was a member of many international scientific communities, and I'm not going to mention all of his activities because he was very active, but specifically was also a member of the Sagol School of Neuroscience in Tel Aviv. And I did a summer project at his lab during my bachelor degree. Other students from ELSC who worked with him are Nan Steingart, who was his master student, and Jonathan Salmon. Also, he has some personal and scientific relations to some scientists here, like he was in the army with Sally Fish, and others. So, I would like to say that Eshel was an enthusiastic scientist and an individual with a colorful and energetic temperament. He was never afraid, and in fact, was even attracted to exploring new domains in science, which were sometimes considered exotic or even esoteric, such as, among many other issues that he was researching, cognition in bacteria. And this strain of bacterium that he discovered, I don't remember now the name, but you can see in Nature 94, that had a phase transition according to some environmental threat. It was changing the way that the colonies were looking like, and he was also interested in the aesthetic aspects of it, as you can see, and also developed a neurochip, and lately was interested in hyperbaric medicine, about which he gave a seminar here last year, 3 months ago. And I think that this passion for exploring the unknown, which sometimes looks a bit esoteric, but it was what made him the special scientist who he was, and his research encompassed so many topics, all of them from the kind that fascinated me personally. And by this, he was a source of inspiration to many young students with similar interests, especially those interested in interdisciplinary research in complex biological systems, exactly the kind of students who are sitting here in the room. And more personally, for me, Eshel was a very significant figure in my personal academic way so far, especially in the first years, which involved a lot of question marks. So he was always the address for consulting and really opening the heart. He was interested not only in science, but also in personality and the emotional aspect of life with young students, and cared a lot about helping us to find the right direction that will fit exactly these students. And maybe related to that, he was also an activist in physics education and fought for a higher level in physics education in schools. So at the time when I was considering where to go for my PhD, I had a talk with Eshel, and he recommended the ITMC program and convinced me that this is the right place for me. And I would like to thank Eshel for everything that he did for me. Thank you for that.
week, I got an SMS that is still on my phone, and it's the last proposal that Eshel Ben Yaakov gave another friend of mine to have a symposium on the difference between meta-theory and scientific theory. Meta-theory meaning meta-philosophical theory. But he died, so the person asked me, will you come and continue this? This was this week. This was yesterday, sorry, at 12 o'clock. Okay, we'll have to continue live, and today we have here the second talk of Drazen Prelec. I don't know if I pronounce your name correctly. Close.
But since you were perfect, I must have done it.
I'll say a few words. So Drazen Prelec is the invited speaker of the fourth Heller lecture of 2015. Drazen was presented beautifully by Jonathan. So I will only tell you that he comes from the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science and the Department of Economics and the Sloan School at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. And for those of you who were not here on Tuesday, I warmly recommend to look at the website, hear what Jonathan said about you, and hear what you told us. That was exciting. I believe that those of you who heard the lectures on Tuesday enjoyed it like I did. I enjoyed it a lot. While you promised that the word neuroscience will not be mentioned in your talk, you did talk about neuroscience, as we discussed this afternoon. The approach, the questions, the experiments come to show us how intriguing is this machine that we call brain. At least in my brain, the question how to project from Drazen theory and findings to experimental neuroscience is a real challenge that we have to take to understand the internal reality of our brain and how it is continuously updated and generated and updated. Again, Drazen and Danica, who is here, she found a way. You are here. Thank you very much for coming. We are happy to host you at our home here in Jerusalem, and we look forward to promote and extend collaboration with you and your colleagues at the MIT. And today, I would like to just say a word before we start. It's the second Heller lecture, and I would like to say a word on behalf of these dear people who made these lectures possible, the Heller family. Do we see it? Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Forgot to do this, so I will tell you again. Each lecture I tell you this, and I will continue telling this because I hope you will remember it. So in 2002, Morgan and Michael Heller from London decided to donate an annual sum of £15,000 to establish this high-profile series in computational neuroscience. You can read what it says, but basically, I am happy to see that this series continues for so many years, and I almost know, meeting Michael not too long ago, that this series will continue till one of you, the youngest student here, will present the speaker of 2050 annual meeting of the Heller lectures. I made calculations that the youngest here will be here at my age in 2050. I just cannot imagine how it will look, but it will be in the other building also. Okay. So here is the Heller lecture series certificate of recognition and appreciation to you, Drazen Prelec, for your contributions to the academic inquiry to the Academic Inquiry and Exchange for the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Brain Sciences here at the campus of Edmond and Edmond J. Safra at Givat Ram, signed by Israel Nelken, the director of the PhD program, and myself, the director of the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Brain Sciences. Thank you. Now you have to wear this.
Thank you very much. So I will take a minute to switch computers, but also let me add my word of condolence for the loss of your colleague last week. And it's quite an extraordinary experience.
That should be very
Oh, this should be. It's quite an experience to be a Heller lecture, I have to say. This is a week that my wife and collaborator will remember as a wonderful week. I'm just going to ask for your patience while I swap the machines. Right. So, I want to thank again, can you hear me? It's fine? Yeah, perfect. Elon and Jonathan, and especially the students last night for a wonderful dinner out in the open air and a discussion actually anticipating many of the issues I will discuss today. I didn't mention the word neuroscience, or I didn't hope not to mention it in the talk 2 days ago, but it will come up today. I think the one way to approach this talk is as an example of work in neuroeconomics, and there are quite a lot of things bundled up in that phrase. Neuroeconomics is a field that is about, I would say, 15 years old. And it's a descendant of another subdiscipline, behavioral economics. And there's a certain progression of empirical work, theoretical work, and then neuroscience work that's characteristic of neuroeconomics. And you'll see in the discussion today different stages of this type of research activity. It's very speculative. If you're a hard scientist, you'll find much of what I will present today highly speculative. But a typical progression, and again, it starts with an observation that some aspect of human behavior is, you could say, irrational or just not quite rational. And that particular focus of interest on irrationalities is actually almost rooted right here in Jerusalem in the Center for Rationality and the work done by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. And it's a school that has been extraordinarily productive because it was aware of the principles of rational action. The principles of rational action defined, as it were, a background against which you could see where individual actions deviate. And this simultaneous awareness of what rationality would demand and what human behavior actually is, that contrast has been enormously productive, just as a matter of psychological research. It's not an approach that everyone subscribes to in psychology. There are people who say psychology is about how people behave. The ideal is not interesting. But in practice, being aware of what an ideal is been tremendously useful. So usually you start by an observation that some aspect of behavior is not rational. And then the economists step in, because economics is a field that owns rationality in a very tangible way. Much of economic modeling is based on the assumption that individuals are little machines that compute utilities, compute probabilities using Bayes' rule. And then typically what you need to do is to, what economists would like to do when they're confronted with this evidence, is see if there's a way of efficiently introducing some new element into the rational model that will deal with behavioral violations. That's theoretical behavioral economics. And then the third stage often is to see, well, we have here a computational model that's not rational. Can we find evidence of the workings of that model at the neural level? And this would be the neuroeconomic stage. So you start with rationality, violations of rationality, an alternative model that's not fully rational, and then neuroscience. And that's the progression that's characteristic. Now, I'm going to focus on a particular violation of rationality here. It's a violation that's profoundly important, and it's one that we should be grateful that we have. So these are not irrationalities that we should want to eliminate from our behavior, but these are irrationalities that we want to not preserve, but we should be grateful that we're built in this way. And if the irrationality involves the fact that we seem to be motivated by more than the causal consequences of actions. That our actions are not just circumscribed motivationally by what they can achieve physically, causally. Causality does not bracket human motivation. And this may be unique to humans. I'm not aware of other creatures. Other creatures are consequential. They care about causal consequences. But people care about more than causal consequences. And that's the interesting phenomenon. So I'll talk a little bit about psychology, a little bit about computational modeling, and then one experiment that is done in our lab. I should say also at the outset there's another Israeli connection here, because the model that I will present, the computational model, was done in collaboration with my first student at MIT, Ronit Bodner, who was Israeli. And she was one of my best students, if not the best, but in a courageous act of self-signaling, she decided to abandon academia after a very successful PhD, embark on a very different career, very satisfying, but not in academics. She is the co-author of all the theoretical model that I'm going to present. So let me start. Then the empirical work, the neuroscience work, is very recent and not published yet, but it's done in collaboration with several scientists, and my wife also here. So let me start with a quote by a psychologist, George Ainsley, which I think puts the issue on paper very nicely. Ainsley here is discussing, this is actually Ainsley and a collaborator, Monterosa. Ainsley is concerned with the problem of smoking. How do people stop smoking? And in the background there's a discussion of rules and rule following, rules that people have. But he has a very nice description of a hypothetical situation of a smoker who is trying to quit, but who craves a cigarette. And then you imagine that an angel whispers to this smoker that whether or not she smokes a cigarette, she's destined to smoke a pack a day from now on. And the question, if you're a smoker and you know that you will smoke from tomorrow on, you really have no reason not to smoke this particular cigarette. And then he turns the problem around and says, what if the angel says that instead she will never smoke from tomorrow on? Well then, of course, this is the last cigarette that you can smoke. Why not smoke it? And therefore, the conclusion is if you know what the future will be, that simply eliminates any motivation to refrain from smoking this particular cigarette. Now, this may seem not very surprising, but it's very difficult to rationalize this behavior in any kind of a logical fashion. Ainsley's interpretation is that what is crucial to self-control in this setting is that you're not really sure if you will stop smoking, and therefore this individual cigarette doesn't just incrementally harm your health, but also provide a signal about your future. And therefore, the stakes on this single decision are suddenly amplified, because with this cigarette, you're not only marginally affecting your health, you're also in some sense communicating to yourself how much you will smoke in the future. But that signal is fictional. There's nothing physical that links these two things together. So this would be an action, to put a label on it. The action of smoking a single cigarette, or the way we might interpret it, is that it's potentially diagnostic of an underlying disposition, which would be the disposition to smoke and not to smoke. And it provides good or bad news about the disposition. And it's really the informational value that's critical, not the physical consequence, but the informational value. And now, if you're thinking about this problem from a rational perspective, you have a paradox, because if you are choosing an action precisely to create a positive signal about some internal state that you don't know, and you're aware of that, that would seem to be destroying the value of the signal. That's the paradox of self-signal. So now, just to put a very kind of big brackets around this, when we think of self-signaling, we can think of really three different categories of phenomena that all fit in this rubric. One is when there are situations where you're the internal state so you assume that there's some internal state of the person that they're not aware of. That internal state is revealed by an action, and therefore you're motivated to take an action that reveals a positive signal. So there are really three subcategories of signals that we can think about. One is where the internal state is something that's intrinsic, which you intrinsically care about. It could be your health or your moral character. Second category would be where the internal state is something that is useful for some future actions. This would be, let's say, willpower. And a third, and this is conceptually very interesting, is that the internal state is something that you believe is correlated between you and other members of the community. And this is an issue that's crystallized in the voters paradox. Within standard economics, one of the usual, it's well known that it's very hard to generate an explanation of why people vote. Because if there's anything that you can be certain about in this life, is that your vote will not affect the outcome of any substantial election. A single vote will never count. And this is true not just of voting, it's true of political engagement, it's true of collective actions in general. That a single person has a very small impact on the collective outcome. The question is, for a rational individual, why does a rational individual vote? Or why does a rational individual participate, spend energy to work for collective good when their impact on that is negligible? There's a variety of interpretations. Some of the standard interpretation is that people have they desire the ceremonial aspect of voting, to be a citizen, it's a duty and so forth. But I think an easy way to see the limitations of that is to ask yourself, would you vote if you knew that your vote wouldn't count? For some reason, the machine is malfunctioning. Would you vote in that case? I think most people would not vote. And if you try to introspect, I think people have a feeling that if they take an action, that somehow will, the story that I'm giving is, if you take an action, it will actually provide information about what other people like you will do. Therefore, the action is a signal about what the collective will do. And the motivation for voting in that sense becomes that by voting, you are creating positive expectations of the outcome for your candidate. So, now you can say, is there, do people self-signal? There's a large body of evidence that's consistent with psychological evidence. I'll give you just a few samples. For example, in the health domain, there was an experiment done by a psychologist Del Paulus, where he told his subjects ahead of time that creativity is correlated with schizophrenia. And then he asked them to write an essay. And he told other subjects he didn't tell that. And these essays were evaluated for creativity by an independent panel. The subjects who were informed that there is a correlation between schizophrenia and creativity produced essays that were much less creative. Of course, they could not have effect there. Another study was done on spouses. You are asked to do a questionnaire an inventory of your married life, including how often do you argue, how many fights you have, and so on. And before you answer the questions, one half of the subjects are told that there's statistical evidence that fighting with your spouse is very healthy for your marriage because you vent, so on. And other half of the subjects are told that actually fighting with your spouse is very bad because you can imagine the story. And people who hear one story report many more arguments. People who hear the other story report many fewer arguments in their marriage. So this is self-signaling because obviously you cannot, by faking the results of this questionnaire, you cannot affect the success of your marriage. Okay? So there has to be something in the brain that's a short circuit, because if you're aware that you're deliberately, changing the results, it's not going to help your marriage at all. You're just giving our answers to the questionnaire. So that's another example of self-signaling. And then a third case, this we discussed with the students last night. This was done by Amos Tversky and Elder Shafir. It's sufficiently, I think, this is an experimental version, yes.
But couldn't it be a matter of self-image?
It could be a matter of self-image, but it certainly is a matter of self-image. But if you know that you're boosting the self-image, then you will not boost your self-image. Because presumably, to boost your self-image, if someone else tells you you're great, it's one thing. If you tell yourself I'm great, it's another thing. That's the paradox. So this is I'm going to mention this experiment because it's stunningly austere and clear cut. It's an experimental version of something that's known in decision theory and philosophy as a Newton's paradox. I will just explain the structure of the experiment. This was done quite a while ago, and unfortunately has never been. There should be a whole experimental literature on this, but there isn't one. The experiment was done in a laboratory, and the critical decision took place at the end of a longer session where subjects participated by playing competitive games through the computer against anonymous opponents. And the very last, and in these games, they were earning points, and the points were converted to money at the end of the experiment. Now, the matter of interest is the very last decision they had to make. The last decision was presented as a choice between that there were two boxes displayed on the screen, and one box was known to contain 20 points, and the other box contained either nothing or 250 points. And their choice was to take the points that are in box B alone, or the sum of the points in both boxes. Now, you might think that's a ridiculous decision, because if you take the sum of the points in both boxes, you will get 20 more points. And it's explained, it's made absolutely clear that the number of points in this box is not affected by your decision. It's already been determined. So why is this an interesting decision at all? Because they were also told that this was a completely deceptive piece of information, that there's an 85% accurate MIT computer program that has predicted whether you will choose the points in both boxes or just the points in box B. And if the computer has predicted that you will choose both boxes, then it's put nothing here. But if the computer has predicted that you will choose only these points, only the button here, then there's 250 points there. The computer has made a prediction, and you cannot affect it. And the experimental data, or at least the majority of subjects, faced with this decision, will just put the points in box B. What does that choice do? That choice reveals that you're the type of person. Now, by the way, how does the computer program know what you would choose? It knows because it was given information about how you play the other games. And even though this statement was not true, the authors noted that building such a program is not a science fiction. In particular, one of the diagnostics for choosing both boxes is if you behave rationally in previous games. Rationally meaning you do not cooperate in prisoner's dilemma games. So if you're taking courses in economics, decision theory, and so on, you reveal that to your previous choices, and therefore you take both boxes and you get 20 points. And as someone observed, it would be a case of being punished for being rational, which is logically possible. So this is, again, the reason I mention it is because here it's absolutely transparent that the rational option is to take the sum of the points, but people still exhibit self-signaling. So this is kind of an introduction. Now why, as I said, why is this important? It's important because it allows, I think it makes self-control and also collective action possible. Because it means when we act, we're not just concerned about what that action will achieve causally, which is often very hard to do. If you're dieting and you're tempted by one cake, that one cake is at lunch. That one cake will not change how well your clothes fit. You must believe that this is a signal of something larger. If you throw away a little bit of trash out in the nice green areas, that's a small detail, but you must believe it's somehow indicative of something larger. So self-signaling escalates the significance of very small actions, which is very important for culture. And I'll just say one other broad cultural comment. If you're interested in sociology, self-signaling, who is the first person who actually, I think, speculated and defined this was Max Weber in his interpretation of why Protestant religion was so important for the development of capitalism. And he traced it exactly to the religious doctrine of Calvinism. You know, Calvinism believes in predestination, which means that you cannot affect your outcome in the afterlife. But it means that every little action you take is potentially a signal of the outcome. And that creates much more powerful information than religious beliefs would say. If you're a good person, good things will happen. It's that God has determined whether you are good or ahead of time, and your actions reveal that pre-existing condition. And that actually magnifies motivation in a way that's extraordinary. So now this is part one. Part two is now the model. This is a model that Ronit Bodner and I wrote quite a while back. And the way to view it is to say, what do we need to, as a computational model, it says, how do we need to adjust the maximization equations so that self-signaling becomes predictive and predictable? Because if you write down traditional utility maximization formula, they will never predict choosing just one box. If you write them out, and they will never predict, predict self-signaling. So the computational model here, and this is in some sense, there's a variety of other models that have been developed since then, but this is in some sense the simplest model, and it exploits a bit of theory that was jointly invented by economists and biologists, evolutionary biologists, which is signaling theory. So the assumption is that a person, a decision maker, has an internal state that they're not concerned about, that they're not aware of. That state is, but they have some beliefs given by, the marker of that state is the parameter theta. The beliefs about this parameter are given by prior beliefs of P of theta, but a person also has some preferences over theta, which is their preferences about what that unknown internal parameter is. And what's important is that that internal parameter, even though it's not accessible to consciousness, does influence decisions. It does influence the hand that makes the choice, that pushes the button. So the only way you can find out something about your theta is to actually make a real decision, not a hypothetical decision, a real, irrevocable decision. How does a decision reveal something about your parameter? Well, there's a minimal utility model that says that when you choose an action will indicate by the letter X. That X, the action produces two types of utility. The first is the utility of the consequences generated by X. And the second is the change in your beliefs about your internal parameter that are caused by revealing that you're a certain type of person, that you have a certain value of theta. So this first part of the equation is the utility that you get from X conditional on having a particular value of theta. And the second part is, you might say, the change in your self-image produced by revealing that you're that type of person. So if we think of, if I have examples here of, if theta is, let's say theta is courage. You don't know how brave you are. And then there's a moment when you can make a choice, and how you feel about that action is determined by your true level of courage, which you don't know. But then depending on whether you are, after the fact, ashamed or proud of what you did, that changes your expectations here. So that is the minimal model. And now, where signaling theory comes in is in determining what inferences you're allowed to make about yourself as a function of making the action. And economists generally assume that your inferences are self-consistent, that is, they are that as a person, when you signal something, you're aware that you're trying to signal to yourself. And that means that there's a consistency between actions and interpretations of your own actions. The actions must maximize, you must choose an action that maximizes the sum of these two parts. And the beliefs that you have after making the action are that you are the type of person for whom this expression is maximized by the action that you take. And this is the self-consistency between actions and interpretations. Now this has a consequence that, the P of theta given X is so far, everything I've said so far, it's an undetermined free distribution. And in signaling theory, the assumption is made that this distribution can put positive probability only on thetas for whom the action that's taken actually maximizes that expression. So there's a equilibrium condition. The action that you take is optimal given your theta, and the theta that you have is the theta for whom that action is optimal. This has one consequence that maybe I should just try to explain it with a stylized example. Let's suppose that you are these are actions range from some continuum of good and bad actions. And this is your self-image defined by a distribution P of theta. And so let's suppose you're taking actions that are somewhere in the middle range, good to bad. And a natural interpretation is that your self-image is tracking these actions. Now, and if you take an action that's slightly better than average, your self-image moves. And if you take an action that's worse than average, your self-image deteriorates. Now, what happens in the self-signaling model is that because you're aware that part of your motive for acting is precisely to get a good self-image, you discount the informational value of that action. Just as if someone is good to you, someone else is good to you, you don't automatically trust that person because you think they're maybe just trying to impress you. And here the model requires that you impose the same strictness on yourself. And the implication that this has, if you take it literally, is that you have this discounting phenomenon that you are actually quite good, but you are a little bit suspicious that maybe part of the reason you're good is you just want to impress yourself. And then at the very extreme point, you have something that resembles a compulsion. That is, you are doing the right thing every time. Doing the right thing doesn't move your self-image at all because you are aware that you're only trying to impress yourself. And why does this mechanism work? This mechanism works out of pure fear, because if you take one action that falls away from perfection, your self-image would really collapse. And this would be an interpretation of rigid rules. You're following a rule every time. You're never certain whether you've confirmed what you wanted to confirm, but one step away from perfection, and your self-image goes down. So that is a natural implication of this type of model for someone who's extraordinarily concerned with some particular dimension.
How to form in a community, and for someone who is separated from community, this kind of decisions? How much is it influenced? Assume that you're isolated somehow, and you have to get some decisions. And you are surrounded by people that can judge your decisions.
So this model is a brutally isolated individual, model of an isolated individual. And it's interesting, I mentioned Max Weber, and one of the moves in Calvinism is that it may be individual, very isolated in terms of their relationship, as opposed to a communal. So this is, you could take this model and interpret it in a social sense, that other people are watching what you're doing and making inferences about yourself. But, and I'm sure that's the reality. But if the same mechanism works even for Robinson Crusoe, okay, that is very important for human psychology.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
You have to play it.
That's okay. Sorry. Who should I recommend? Somebody else. Not Robinson Crusoe. Okay. So, now speculation, just for one or two slides. If we want to see, how could the brain implement this computational model? Well, it would need at least two modules that are somewhat independent. There's an action module that decides whether to choose X, Y, Z, W. And independently, there's a little entity that watches what you do, assesses that as if it's I wanted to call this actor critic, but that term is taken in learning theory, the actor critic model. It really is, if we forget that there exists an actor critic model, this is an actor critic model. There's an entity that acts, an entity that evaluates the action as if it's watching somebody else, and then computes a little bit of pleasure or pain depending on whether that action is informative in a good or bad way. That would be an implementation at the neural level. Now, now we're going to turn to an experiment that looks at this in a very, very specific setting, where what's at stake is really a person's self-image with respect to their honesty. But before describing the experiment, let me just flesh out a bit some of the implications of this way of thinking. One is that there's a common currency of reward that includes both consequential reward and this type of symbolic diagnostic reward, which is what an action reveals in terms of information. The second implication is that this is now coming from the rational aspect of the model. That an action tells you something good about yourself only if it's costly. Okay? A costless good deed doesn't tell you anything. It has to be costly, and the more it costs, the more information there is. Third, the informational value increases with the amount of uncertainty you have about yourself in a particular setting. So if you're dead sure what you're like, this whole thing doesn't apply. But only if you're chronically unsure about yourself, then there's potential for this. And the fourth is that there is in the model, there's two weights on these two components of utility, and there's things you can do to move up the diagnostic and make it more important. But probably, I would say the most distinctive one here is really the second one, because that really comes purely out of self-signal theory. Okay, so this is now the experiment itself. The experiment is, I will just describe, first, let me just describe what it looks like from the perspective of the subject. It's an fMRI study where subjects are asked whether they recognize or not certain words. Most of the words are real, but a subset of the words are not real. And the important thing is that they're not, that we don't check in this experiment, we don't check whether they actually know the words or not. And sometimes they're paid for saying that they recognize the word, and sometimes they're paid for saying that they don't recognize the word. And they know which word is a word that they want to recognize, and which one is one that they do better if they don't recognize. And it's purely their own honesty here, because we don't check. So, this is what it looks like. If you saw this for a second, the word Minerva flashed. And yes, no means you're now sitting in the scanner, fMRI scanner. You press yes if you recognize the word, no if you don't. And by the way, because the word comes in for only a quarter of a second, there's some obvious words that you could legitimately fail to recognize because it just went by too fast. So there's some margin for error that gives you an excuse maybe to recognize words. A blue square means that this is a word that you win 10 cents if you press yes. So then you would say 10 cents if you press yes. All you have to do to win 10 cents is just to say yes to any word that's in the blue square. Sometimes, okay, so that was the word aquafina. That's not a word, the word doesn't exist. It's in a yellow box, meaning that you win 10 cents if you press no. That's a bad word that you don't want to recognize. You win 10 cents if you say no. And then occasionally, you get a word that's in the gray box, which means that this is a controlled trial, there's no money you can make. Just say it if you're ready. By the way, logistic heresy does not exist. Although there is a logistic function and there is a heresy, but the combination is not real. And they go through close to 200 of these trials. If you want to know what MIT, well, these are not MIT students. MIT and Craigslist. This is the percent of left list is just a random sample of words that are fake, and this is the percentage of recognition of these words. And these are real words. and the percent of recognition then is recognized by 34% of the subjects, which you might think is a depressing statistic. And then there's somebody called Jackson Howell, who doesn't exist, who's recognized by more percent than Augusto Rodin. That's what? Okay, so I have to be a little more careful. Actually, with Google, it's very hard to find words that don't exist. But for the purpose of this, it doesn't matter if they exist. But they're given a category, so when they say they're recognized, they know the next 10 words will be, let's say, thinkers. So, yeah. Okay. Now the other feature here is that I want to make sure that I almost out of time. Okay. That half of the subjects are asked or invited to sign an honest oath that during the whole experiment they will tell the truth and always provide honest answers. This is a manipulation that was suggested by one of our co-authors, Stéphane Key, who's a French economist, and it turns out all but one of the subjects who were asked for this did sign it, and this has a massive impact on their behavior in the experiment. So, a little bit of data, and then just a little bit of the brain data. This is the percent this is without oath, the percent of fake words that are recognized when you make money for recognizing, no money when you lose money for recognizing. So people recognize many more of these. These are real words. Again, blue is when they're paid for recognizing, and they recognize more than yellow. What you see when you impose the oath on this, the difference by financial condition really dramatically shifts. And in fact, if you look at the data a little bit more closely, this is a measure of how much their answer is biased by financial incentives. And roughly, this is something you get very often in these type of experiments. You have a subset of subjects who are essentially almost trying to make as much money as they can. You have another subset that's somewhat in a gray area of deception or self-deception. And then this would be people who are have absolute integrity, meaning that their answers are not biased for money at all. And an important aspect of these results is that if we had 16 subjects who signed the oath and 16 who didn't, since you can create matched pairs, the most deceptive subject in the oath, the most deceptive subject without oath, rank from top to bottom. And then you can see how deceptive they are. So this is the most deceptive subject. This is how much they deceive. That person without oath deceives, and this is how much that person, their matched twin, deceives under oath. And roughly what happens is, since 0 is integrity and positive numbers are self-deception and deception, the gray area would be a level that's statistically significant. And so the implication is when you impose an oath, essentially the individuals who would be exaggerating their earnings are going down to a level that's just at the threshold of statistical significance. So I will have probably 2 slides on the brain data, but I want to set them up by focusing on specific contrasts. When a person makes a judgment, we can classify that judgment into one of 3 categories. And they press yes or no. The no incentive are the controls trials, when the word was in a gray box. The win is when they made a response that was rewarded. And then most interestingly, the forego response is when they made a response that gave up money that they could have earned by making a different choice. And the contrast between brain activity when they forego and the brain activity when they win corresponds theoretically to the contrast between diagnostic and outcome utility. Because when you give up money, you're signaling to yourself an honest response, a costly honest response. And so So by and large, we're going to focus on this contrast.
And I have just enough time to give you that one slide. Where do we look? We look at the reward regions, which are the striatum and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and we localize them using a meta-analysis that was published 2 years ago. So let me just, I think I will end with just this slide and the next slide, because this is the essence of the result. The vertical axis is the difference in reward activation between the trials when they give up money they could have earned and the trials when they win money. And the standard result in the brain literature is that winning money activates reward areas, anticipating winning, being informed that you've won, so on. This is what triggers the striatum, the dopaminergic network. The blue, so this is now splitting subjects, and there's various ways of looking at this data, but this is a easy to explain split. The red box are the 6 individuals who exhibited most bias for money. So we could say they are the cheaters. The blue box is everybody else. And you get this classification roughly going back these 6 people. This is the bad group. The bad group experience reward when they do the honest thing. That is when they give up money. This is for the striatum. This is for the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The people who are toward the honest end, they actually experience more reward when they win money. And you could say, if you know you're honest, then what should make you happy is to win money. But if you suspect you're dishonest, what should make you happy momentarily is those relatively rare occasions when you suffer cost for an honest response. It's the exceptional honest response that would so that's to result in one further, and this is my last data slide. Why do people who are, in terms of the overall session, relatively less honest? There's 2 possibilities what could be going on. One is they experience more reward when they give up money, or alternatively, they experience less reward when they win money because they feel guilt. And we can distinguish between those 2 possibilities by looking. This is now the contrast between giving up money and the control condition when no money is at stake. And this is the contrast between winning money and the control condition when no money is at stake. And essentially the difference in the groups appears in this contrast between giving up money and the no money control. So what's important about this panel here is that it's comparing conditions which have exactly the same consequence. In both cases, they're not winning money. But in one case, they could have won money but didn't. In the other case, they could not have won money. And so it's really, the signal is there because you've taken an action that gave up something. It's not the consequence that matters. The consequence is the same. You're getting nothing. But in one case, that consequence is accompanied by a realization that you passed on money that you could have won. And it's that particular contrast that registers the distinction between the groups. So I'm going to stop it. I think we're out of time. And just want to acknowledge growing and wonderful group of collaborators on this project. But as I said, I think the stretch from theory to experiment is always quite large in these types of studies. That's good time. So
the brain evidence is generally consistent with diagnostic utility being tapping the reward mechanism. But it's one experimental data point.
Any questions? Yes. Come on.
So other rewards, maybe there are other measures for measuring rewards, more behavioral, there are a bunch of things. I'm not sure, but did you think about having another more behavioral or different measures for reward, except of this MRI position?
I think reward is where the fMRI is worth a huge expense, because I think I would love to have an instrument that measures reward without complications of that particular apparatus. I think these are, I don't think they'll manage spin responsive. I think what we're picking up here is not reward in a very strong sense. It's not, I would doubt that this is reward that people actually consciously experience.
Or asking them, did you feel better?
I think these are very small, subtle reward signals, and the only thing that there is a technology now that's being advertised, which is automatic facial recognition. So you have a camera that looks at your face and interprets it. But I don't think generally reward is not emotion. Emotion you can measure in all sorts of different ways. These are very weak. Doesn't mean they're not important, but I think they're weak signals.
About the model. So would the model still work if data doesn't actually exist, but you only think that it exists?
Absolutely.
Okay, and related to that, so if you assume that there is such a thing as an internal state that somehow represents your character, so I think that there's an additional possibility, like when you're talking about the case of cigarettes, and in these cases also about reward, that it's not just about finding out about your internal data, your internal character, but actually that it's possible for your decision to affect your internal character. I mean, it's an active process of changing it.
So that's absolutely true, and in real life it's very hard to distinguish whether what's going on is a causal link between your action and your character, whether you're shaping your character causally, or whether you're revealing your character through your actions. And probably in reality, with something like smoking, it may be a mixture of both. But we know from the psychological experiment that even in situations where you make it absolutely clear there's no causal connection, motivation is still there. So causality might add to it, but it's not necessary. And so that's why models which don't require causality are very different animals theoretically, and the mechanism that can deliver them is very different mechanism. But you're right, if you think of something like, it's very hard to find situations where there's absolutely no causality.
Yeah, I mean, okay, maybe those situations are just not realistic, but yeah, that there is causality. Or another way that I was thinking about it, you could put it, is that we don't have perfect control over our choices, but that there are correlations between our actions and our consequent actions afterwards. So in that case also, I think we would naturally find some kind of a
well, the correlations and correlations are okay, but assuming a person really interprets correlation as causality, as it were. That's one way to kind of putting a label on this. When people chronically they take a correlation and then they act as if it's causal. That's one way. Because in that Newton's experiment, there's a correlation. The people who choose one box get more money than the people who choose two boxes. If that computer program exists, you can watch people going through the experiment, and those who choose one box get a lot of money, those who choose both boxes get a little money. And then it's your turn to choose. And now if you confuse correlation with causality, you will choose one box. Now we know the distinction is quite sophisticated, between correlation and causality. But if you want to write down a computational model of action that confuses causation with correlation, that's what you need to do to explain this behavior. And the computational models generally don't confuse this. The computational models understand the difference between causality and correlation.
I would like to look from another angle of view on evolution. Why would it develop or stay like this? What is the benefit to have these four things? And there are a lot of experiments that are read them all about higher primates, bonobo and chimpanzee with a lot, and we know that they have a higher reward and jealous and everything. So, is there any match between them? Do you know?
I think somewhere in the evolution that these additional modules appeared, and they were enormously useful. Now I don't know where the line would be. I said they were useful because they amplified the rewards that are associated with very small action. I think that's the multiplier effect. Now I don't know if whether at the primus level you have anything that would resemble this.
Someone would say, give something from himself to another one. So, yes. I don't know if that's benefit again to other theories that are more heavy about says that when you do something, it is to show to the other people that you are better.
That you're better.
Yeah, so you can see that what's interesting, all of these models, when I'm talking and thinking about it, it's about communities, and not about animals that is usually separated. So it has the meaning that somebody is watching you and maybe you'll be rewarded from another.
I mean, there are, the evolutionary biologists co-invented this signaling model, but it's always signaling to other animals. So animals, the antelopes that jump like this, they do that because they signal something. That is exactly it's the same model. So now the question is, does the antelope alone also jump?
Okay, it's just continue into the
thinking. Precisely it. Yeah. Because does the animal, when nobody else is around, engage in this sort of costly behavior just to prove that they have some characteristic? That's the question. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yes.
In your talk, you mentioned there is experimental evidence that creativity correlates with schizophrenia. So it reminded me of that sentence which was told by Steve Jobs that the best thing he ever tried in his life is LSD. So are these two phenomena somehow related?
Well, actually, I don't even know how true that is. That schizophrenia is correct. I don't know whether that's given as a cover story just to get the experiment going. And LSD, I don't know anything about. Now this is kind of almost scientific gossip. I mean, what I remember from my graduate student days is that extremely high verbal ability and low quantitative ability is a very dangerous diagnostic for schizophrenia combination of high verbal, low quantitative. But it's certainly a plausible story which you can tell subject, and then you can imagine yourself suddenly becoming very uncreative as you put your essays together.
All right.
Yeah.
So let me understand this Calvinistic model.
Yes.
A person wants to prove to himself that he is going to be saved.
Yes.
It might be a case that he wants to prove to his neighbors as well that he is the chosen one to be saved.
Yes.
So
Not if he's a good Calvinist.
right. Well, it's a matter of degree. He might be good enough, but still wants to impress his neighbor. So would you be able to sort of distinguish? oneself, I think it's a reflex arc.
That's right.
So it doesn't matter if it was chosen by selection to jump to signal, but even when he's alone, it's a reflex arc.
So Max Weber had, I think, exactly the right. He said, if you're Calvinist, then there is no second chance.
No.
Okay? And he compared it to Catholics, there's always second chance.
Right.
And therefore you can always wait till tomorrow to be good tomorrow. Right?
Right.
If you're Calvinist, if you do something that reveals your destiny, there's no opportunity to make up because, God doesn't change his mind, right? Okay. So he says that has made people extremely precise in their behavior. And he pointed out what was really characteristic of these Calvinists and others is that all life became very structured. So that instead of saying Methodist to method, Puritan to Puritan, was, and then when a person starts that way, then small differences become easier to see. So it becomes easier to spot any imperfection. And then any little difference becomes very dangerous. The kind of escalation. That's his interpretation. Now, you ask whether people are impressing others in the community. Of course they are. But I'm not an expert in Calvinism, but what Weber really said is he emphasizes that there's a particular aspect of Calvinism that is not social, that the community cannot help you. It's you alone in this theological assumption. You alone somehow, that makes it very, I would say, harsh. So.
But you see, it's very interesting the difference between Western culture and Eastern culture. And that's very similar, although not the same. In Eastern culture, if you believe in reincarnation, then you say, okay, if I do this bad thing now, this will be a bad baggage for all the reincarnations. But if I do the good thing and I die, well, I have many more reincarnations and that's fine. In the Western, you say, okay, I'll do this bad thing and then I will compensate by many good things. So if people believe in reincarnation, they will behave in one way, like in the East. And if they believe in the Western model, they will behave otherwise. So cultures do have this tendency to create
They will create a belief, and then if you really believe this is important for you, then that, I said two modules, and the other module is evaluating you and updating your beliefs.
All right. Thank you very much.